But I'll start with Chesterton and Belloc, as they're going to be accompanying me in the talk anyway. And I'll start with what H.G. Wells said about them. H.G. Wells complained that Chesterton and Belloc had succeeded in placing a boozy halo around the Catholic Church. Now, H.G. Wells was wrong, of course, because H.G. Wells was normally wrong. And the only reason he's wrong is because the Catholic Church doesn't need anybody to place a halo around it. It already has its halo, or her halo. She is the bride of Christ. She has her halo as part of her being. But the fact that people that don't understand that, such as H.G. Wells, believe that Chesterton and Belloc had placed a boozy halo around the church is a great tribute not to the church, but certainly to Chesterton and Belloc. So I want to, we have Chesterton and Belloc as our friends here. We have, if you like, George Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells as our enemies. And I'm going to come back to George Bernard Shaw a bit later. But in Chesterton's novel, The Man Who Was Thursday, Gabriel Syme talks about when he was young, he had two extremists for parents. His father was a decadent barbarian who basically descended into drunken debauchery. I can alliterate as well as Chesterton, I can't write as well as he can. While his mother was a Puritan who was a vegetarian and a teetotaler. And I have a healthy distrust of extremists like that. In fact, I admire the words of the great Catholic poet Roy Campbell, who, when he first read Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, turned to his wife and said, "This won't do. This man is a vegetarian teetotalitarian." And in The Man Who Was Thursday, Chesterton talks about drinks that should not be trusted. Creme de menthe, absinthe. These are the drinks of the decadents. And then you have almost as bad on the other side. This will be more shocking for some of you, I'm sure. Cocoa, drinking chocolate. Chesterton actually had a reason for not liking cocoa. It was because the person that owned the big cocoa company was a Puritan and someone that Chesterton disapproved of politically. But this is important. I had a very irritating friend when I was younger. He was irritating because he was right. And when you're young, most people who are right are irritating. And he used to insist, whatever the discussion, whatever the topic, he used to say, "Well, it depends what you mean by," or "we have to define our terms." I'd say, "Shut up. Let's get on with the discussion." But of course he was right. If we don't both agree on what we're talking about, if I say Catholic Church and I'm speaking to Dan Brown, the author of the Da Vinci Code, for those of you that don't know, unless we agree at the beginning to define our terms, we're wasting our time. So my friend was right. So I've begun, if you like, I would like to begin, even on a talk as, I was going to say flippant, but not flippant, it's absolutely crucially important to the future of Christendom. But fun, should we say. By defining our terms. And we need to define the first thing, that ale, that honourable thing which we're discussing this evening, ale, is not, emphatically not, alcohol. Now, we are good Christian men. We should limit our use of Arabic words. Alcohol is an Arabic word. And what does alcohol say? Alcohol is not talking about the wonders of ale, or the wonders of wine, or the wonders of various other fermented or distilled liquors. It's talking about a particular chemical property about it. We don't say, I'm going to the Italian restaurant tonight to have some wheat. We go to an Italian restaurant tonight to have some pizza or some pasta. Ale is not alcohol. One of the things about it is it contains alcohol. It contains much more water than it does alcohol. And believe me, if you had less water in it, it would not be ale. The water is at least as important as the alcohol. So that's the one thing it isn't. It isn't alcohol, so let's forget that. At the beginning of Chesterton's novel, The Flying Inn, there's a Muslim character in that novel who gives a lecture about alcohol. And of course, it's like me talking about the Catholic Church with Dan Brown. It's a waste of time. We haven't defined our terms. He doesn't realise that the things he's talking about, ale and wine, are not alcohol. There's something more sublime. There's something, in fact, transcendent. They transcend alcohol. And with that, I'm going to give you a bit of Chesterton. Before the Roman came to Rye and out to Severn strode, the rolling English drunkard made the rolling English road. A reeling road, a rolling road that rambles round the Shire, and after him the parson ran, the sexton and the squire. A merry road, a mazy road, and such as we did tread, the night we went to Birmingham by way of Beachy Head. I knew no harm of Bonaparte, and plenty of the squire, and for to fight the Frenchmen I did not much desire. But I did bash their bagonets, because they came arrayed to straighten out the crooked road an English drunkard made. Where you and I went down the lane with ale mugs in our hands, the night we went to Glastonbury by way of Goodwin Sands. His sins they were forgiven him, or why do flowers run behind him, and the hedges all strengthening in the sun? The wild thing went from left to right, and knew not which was which, but the wild rose was above him when they found him in the ditch. God pardon us, nor harden us, we did not see so clear, the night we went to Bannockburn by way of Brighton Pier. My friends, we will not go again or ape an ancient rage, or stretch the folly of our youth to be the shame of age, but walk with clearer eyes and ears this path that wandereth, and see undrugged in evening light the decent inn of death. For there is good news yet to hear, and fine things to be seen, before we go to paradise by way of Kensal Green. Now I'm going to resist, see, when I was just a writer, I was okay, and then they made me a professor of literature, and that's ruined me. I mean, now what I want to do now is to speak about this poem for the next half an hour, and that's what I have to resist doing. But the key thing is here, of course, this poem is funnier if you're understanding English geography. Brighton Pier, for instance, the night we went to Bannockburn by way of Brighton Pier. Brighton Pier's on the south coast, Bannockburn's in Scotland. It's not an obvious way to go. And the same sort of thing goes without. And at the end, however, it's about death. Before we go to paradise by way of Kensal Green. And what we need to know is that Kensal Green is a Catholic graveyard in North London. And really this poem, as funny as it is and as joyful and jovial as it is and as it deserves to be because of the subject, is actually an allegory of life. There are the follies of youth, and we come to the sobriety of age, and we face the decent inn of death. But death is still an inn. And it's still decent, like a good inn. It's still a place of hospitality. It's still a place of conviviality. It's still a place of communion. It's still a place where men get together to talk, unlike those that don't understand. George Bernard Shaw, for instance, was a socialist and a Nietzschean who believed in the Superman. Therefore, in some senses, although it's unfair of him, a proto-Nazi, because it was the ideas of Nietzsche that led to National Socialism. He continued to believe in Stalin when all the evidence was showing that Stalin was a mass murderer. And not as bad as these things, but maybe indicative of it. He was a teetotaler. And he really was a dictator. He believed and said to Chesterton once that you should be made by the state to exercise. Well, one of the stories I like was at the Fabian headquarters. George Bernard Shaw was one of the leaders of the Fabian Society. And he was woken up one night, and he was staying at the Fabian Society's headquarters, by an awful noise downstairs from the comrades. The comrades were obviously having fun. George Bernard Shaw was never one to countenance fun. So he went downstairs to find out what this nonsense was about. And what should he discover when he goes downstairs? But the comrades gathered around the piano, singing a Chesterton poem, which I won't read the whole of purely because of lack of time, but I'll read the first verse. Old Noah, he had an ostrich farm and fowls on the largest scale. He ate his egg with a ladle in an egg cup big as a pail. And the soup he took was elephant soup, and the fish he took was whale. But they all were small to the cellar he took when he set out to sail. And Noah, he often said to his wife when he sat down to dine, I don't care where the water goes if it doesn't get into the wine. And the refrain when you sing it is, I don't care where the water goes, it doesn't get into the wine, and all the verses end with the same phrase. So Shaw was not amused, but I think most healthy people not only are, but should be. The problem is, and Chesterton spoke about this actually at length in his biography of Shaw, Puritanism and alcoholism are actually mystically united. In England now, there is a cult. That's probably a good word for it, a cult of binge drinking. Binge drinking is when you go out with the express purpose of getting drunk and doing it as quickly as possible. Now, binge drinkers don't drink ale, they don't drink wine, they drink alcohol, because for them it's a drug. They drink normally, actually, things that in England are called alco-pops. Things that are made to taste as much as possible like lemonade, but there's alcohol in it. So you don't actually want to drink ale or wine, you just want to drink something that tastes like lemonade but will get you high. You may as well inject it. That's alcohol, not ale. I remember I went on a pilgrimage in 1991 to see the late Holy Father John Paul II at Częstochowa in Poland. And I was outraged is probably an exaggeration, should we say I was disappointed to find that they banned wine and ale anywhere in the Częstochowa region. I was even more annoyed when there's a rumour went round of somewhere that was selling beer, it was beer not ale, selling beer, and I went down there as quickly as possible to buy it to find that the coach load of Irishmen from Belfast had got there first. It's always disappointing when an Englishman is beaten by the Irish, especially over something as important as ale. But then I discovered a bar as distinct from a pub, and again they're two different things, in the outskirts of Chesterhover. And I thought, I'm going to go in here and have a beer. It's a good thing to do, and I don't know why they've banned it. It's silly. And I went in there to see men, only men, sitting at formica tables with a bottle of vodka in front of them and a glass. And none of them were sitting at the same table as any of the others. They were all sitting by themselves. Nobody was talking. That was an experience of alcohol. And I left the pub, however much I might have fancied a pint of beer, without having a drop. I didn't belong there. I'm not interested in alcohol. I'm interested in ale and wine. Belloc, who is normally right but sometimes wrong, spoke disparagingly about all distilled liquors on the basis they were heretics. Belloc never beat about the bush. And he would always call a heretic even if it was a bottle of whiskey. Whiskey and brandy and gin and vodka were infidel drinks because they were not invented until after the Reformation. And Belloc knew, of course, that nothing good happened after the Reformation. In that, of course, he was wrong. The Jesuits happened after the Reformation, and Father Fezio, at least, is a good one. And there are other good ones. I could start listing them, and I wouldn't list the ones that aren't good. This isn't the place to do it. Belloc's wrong, however, about distilled liquors. We could have a whole other talk about the wonders of single malt whiskey. And maybe you should have a Merry Drinks of Scotland talk and invite me back on that one. Belloc can sometimes be wrong. However, I've begun by defining ale. What it is, what it isn't. It isn't alcohol. It's something good, it's something that comes from God. It goes back, in fact, to the dawn of history, as does wine. I'll come back to that a bit in a moment. But I'd like to now define Merry England, the talk, Tales and Ales of Merry Old England. Merry England is Catholic England. It's nothing else. I speak as an Englishman. England was Catholic for well over 1,000 years, and in the 500 years that it hasn't, almost 500 years that it hasn't been Catholic, there has been an heroic struggle by Catholic Englishmen to win their country back to Christ. That's Merry England. Merry England is it goes even before St. Augustine, the St. Austin Review. I thought I'd find some excuse for free. This is an advertising break, okay? This St. Austin Review that I edit, it's actually named after St. Augustine of Canterbury, that the English call Austin. The Augustinian friars, St. Augustine of Hippo, the Austin friars, that's what the English call them. St. Austin Review is named after St. Augustine of Canterbury because he was the person that converted the pagan English to Catholicism, to Christianity. Same thing, of course, then and now. Is that controversial? However, England was Christian before that. The proto-English martyr, and the proto-martyr of England, was St. Alban, who was martyred by the Romans before the Romans left. The Romans left in about 450 AD. And evidence suggests that England remained Christian to some extent from the time it was introduced, which could have been as early as the 2nd century, in fact probably was as early as the 2nd century, right onwards. So it was a Catholic country for nearly 1,500 years, and it's been a non-Catholic country for less than 500. So we have that 1,500 years of Catholic Merry England that I'm talking about, and then we have St. Thomas More, St. John Fisher, St. Robert Southwell, St. Edmund Campion. We have the 40 martyrs of England and Wales that gave their life to win their country back to Christ. We have the 85 beatified martyrs. We have John Henry Newman, Gerard Manley Hopkins, G.K. Chesterton, Hilaire Belloc, Evelyn Waugh, J.R.R. Tolkien. This is Merry England. This is what we're celebrating tonight. It's the real England. The other England is merely a decay of that real England. I'm going to, at this point, bring Chesterton back into the situation from the novel The Flying Inn. St. George he was for England, and before he killed the dragon, he drank a pint of English ale out of an English flagon. For though he fast right readily in a hair shirt or in mail, it isn't safe to give him cakes unless you give him ale. St. George he was for England, and right gallantly set free the lady left for dragon's meat and tied up to a tree. But since he stood for England and knew what England means, unless you give him bacon, you mustn't give him beans. That was a jibe at George Bernard Shaw if he didn't get it. St. George he is for England, and shall wear the shield he wore when we go out in armour with the battle cross before. But though he is jolly company and very pleased to dine, it isn't safe to give him nuts unless you give him wine. It's a miracle, by the way. I've just noticed a miracle. I thought that my book was bleeding, but I realise it's a miracle almost as wonderful. Someone's placed a flagon of English ale down here. It's spilling all over the place, but I better drink some of it. Now, the most memorable depiction of Merry England, in my opinion, even with these wonderful depictions of Merry England we see from Chesterton and Belloc, was given by J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien wrote about the Lord of the Rings. He wrote many things about the Lord of the Rings, and this isn't a talk about the Lord of the Rings. I cannot resist saying, however, that he said the Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. He also, in another letter, wrote that there was a scale of significance about the important relationship between himself and author with regard to the Lord of the Rings. And the most important of all of them, in this scale of significance, was, in his words, the fact that I am a Christian, which can be deduced from my stories, and in fact a Roman Catholic. However, he also said, and this is the Merry England connection, apart from the Catholic connection, which is the Merry England connection, that below that level, the most important thing of everything else, even more important than his scholarly academic vocation as a linguist, as a philologist, the most important thing below the fact he's a Christian is the fact, and this is a quote, that I was born in the Shire in 1892 in a pre-mechanical age. Now, those of us that know a modicum of history will know that 1892 was not, alas, a pre-mechanical age, least of all in England, where the mechanical age began with the Industrial Revolution, 150 years earlier than that. So what did Tolkien mean? His mother was plunged into poverty, nay, penury, because she became a Catholic in 1900. Her husband had died 4 years earlier, leaving her already in poverty and relying on the charity of her relatives. She becomes a Catholic, and the vast bulk of that money is cut off, and the family is plunged into penury. As a result, they live for a time in slums in Birmingham. Birmingham now is the second largest city in the United Kingdom, the largest city after London. It was, however, 200 years earlier, a village of probably 200 people. It became a city of over 1 million people in the space of 60 or 70 years because of the Industrial Revolution. Tolkien's mother and her 2 sons lived in slums in Birmingham, overlooking the railway line, with the soot and smoke and noise of the railway line, with the smell and the belch of the chemicals coming out of the factories, and the noise of the city. So how was Tolkien talking about a pre-mechanical age? He was born in South Africa, but he remembers nothing about that. He's not talking about that. And he makes this clear elsewhere. The family then moved to a small village called Shire, outside Birmingham, with a village pond, trees to climb on, no factories, no belch, no chemicals, no noise, somewhere for children to play. That's the Shire. And Tolkien, I think, depicts that memory from childhood through his historical understanding of Anglo-Saxon England. He realized that that little glimmer of the Shire in that village at the turn of the 20th century would have been replicated over the whole of England in Anglo-Saxon times. Everywhere was like that village. And we see it again depicted in the Shire far more beautifully than I can try to do here. The key thing is, of course, as Thomas Howard's written memorably in his book Chants of the Dance, that what he saw in the Shire was the echo of the dance of life, as opposed to what we have now, which is the race against time. And of course, without getting into prophecy, if the world is not brought to an end before it happens, the dance will reassert itself because the race is unsustainable, maybe after we die. Tolkien understood that, Belloc understood that, Chesterton understood that. Now, ale. Ah, yes. Ale is not beer. The Germans know that. If you go to Germany, and Dr. Haas will tell you all about Germany, the Germans have beer and have alt. And the English word ale comes from the same German root as alt. Ale is dark, beer is light. If you want a good beer, go to Germany or Belgium. Their alt's not anywhere near as good as English ale. If you want a good ale, there's only one place to come, and that is England. Beowulf, that great English classic. What offends Grendel, the allegory of Satan? It's the song of creation, the echo of Genesis, being sung and told in the mead hall, the Anglo-Saxon equivalent of a pub. And he attacks the mead hall to destroy the mead hall. He attacks the good people in it that are drinking mead and singing of God's creation. He's jealous of those good things. God's creation and part of it, mead, which, by the way, is ale, just in case you're getting confused here. Mead today is a sort of sickly, you might like it, in which case I apologise, but it's a sweet liqueur made from honey. And I think it comes from the word honey. I heard someone, a Ukrainian or maybe someone from Bosnia, but anyway, Slavic language, using the word for honey, which actually sounded very similar to mead. But anyway, that might be completely wrong. Either way, mead is made from honey, but it's ale. The difference is that they hadn't yet worked out how to refine sugar. So for the fermentation process, they used honey and not sugar. In England, of course, sugar cane was not on the map at all in those days. Sugar beet was grown locally, but honey was what they used to ferment with. So it was ale, but the fermentation was with honey and not sugar. Let's move on now a few hundred years in Merry England to Chaucer. The Canterbury Tales, of course, begin from the Tabard Inn in Southwark. And the Tabard Inn is still there. At least it was last time I was there. Or perhaps I just had too much to drink. I think it's still there. There's certainly a pub just south of London Bridge, or Tower Bridge, one or the other. They're only a mile apart. If you want to check it out, you can check both places. Just south of the river of London Bridge or Tower Bridge, which goes back to Chaucer's time. It still has the oak beams. It looks like something which still belongs in the Middle Ages. I don't know if that is the Tabard Inn. It's as old as the Tabard Inn, which is near enough because Chaucer probably had a pint of ale in there before he went to the Tabard Inn to meet up with the other pilgrims. If that isn't true, it should be. Now, of course, in the pilgrims, in the Canterbury Tales, we have both views of ale, its use and its abuse. In the Tabard Inn, the description is of everybody, Chaucer himself, having a thoroughly good time as one should over several pints of ale. But then we hear about the friar who knew the taverns in every town. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with knowing the taverns in every town, although it would take some work. Perhaps there's something wrong with it because you probably would be doing nothing else except that, which is probably not what you should be doing. But of course there are lots of other things wrong with the friar. So Chaucer understood all things made by God, including ale, can be abused. I would say, by the way, at this juncture, that at least as many people die from food abuse as alcohol abuse. That you can drink too much ale, you can eat too many potatoes. Neither is good for you. Both are bad for your health. And then we have, of course, the antidote, the medieval antidote, the Merry England antidote to the friar in Chaucer, which is Friar Tuck, God bless him, who, of course, is the rather rotund friar in the Robin Hood legends, which, again, if they aren't true, they should be. And, if we're going to start saying, can we really admire someone that's that tubby? Well, they say about, and of course I know that Thomas will insist that he went to the gym 5 times a day, but St. Thomas Aquinas was alleged to be rather rotund himself, and there are legends about even having the table cut to size. That may not be true. Chesterton said about Chaucer that he was less delirious than Shakespeare and less morbid than Milton. Basically more sane than both. And I think that what he's getting at there is that Chaucer, as he calls him, is the last flowering of the medieval age, the last flowering of that medieval sanity. We don't have time to go there now, but what Chesterton calls Shakespeare's delirium, I think, was Shakespeare struggling with the horrific totalitarian world he found himself in. As someone who, if he wasn't Catholic, and he probably was Catholic, was certainly sympathetic to Catholicism, and almost definitely knew as friends people that were being hanged, drawn and quartered for their faith. But that takes us off the point a bit. Writing of the medieval period, apart from the depiction of the Shire, Tolkien writes, I think, rather humorously and endearingly about it in Farmer Giles of Ham. Farmer Giles of Ham, by the way, has several pints of beer for breakfast. We should say, by the way, that he was probably drinking small beer, which probably had an alcohol content of 1%, and was certainly drunk in urban areas because it was safer than drinking the water. It was really a way of purifying the water. That little bit of fermentation was enough to purify the water. And Belloc was similar to Tolkien in the sense that they both had this great sense of what I call the theology of place. Any Irishman? How many people here have Irish blood in them? Okay. Now, how many of you know one or two songs about the old country? About Killarney or Galway or what have you? Only a couple. Shameful. Ah, here we go. There, that's better. It's a theology of place. We live in an incarnational world where the Word is made flesh. And it's right for us to feel close to home. Because home with a small h is really a foreshadowing of home with a big H, which is heaven. And cosmopolitanism, one of the many things that's wrong with it, is it forgets about home. It's literally homeless. Would not recognise heaven if it went there, which is probably why it will never get there. Now it brings us on to the Reformation. And again, I'm not going to give you a history of it, but things changed drastically in England. Merry England ceased being so merry. The Reformation was a theological fragmentation. The late Renaissance and the Enlightenment was a philosophical fragmentation. The unity was shattered, except, of course, in the church where it was maintained. And then we had the Industrial Revolution, which in many respects was an outgrowth of that, perhaps a cancerous outgrowth of that. Then we had William Blake with his talking about the dark satanic mills. Who knows William Blake's Jerusalem? Only a couple. I'm not going to sing it. You'll be pleased to know. But it's based, loosely at least, on the legend that St. Joseph of Arimathea brought the Christ child to England. It may not be true, but again, it should be. And did those feet in ancient times walk upon England's mountains green? And was the holy Lamb of God in England's pleasant pastures seen? And did the countenance divine shine out from out those clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here amongst these dark satanic mills? Bring me my bow of burning gold, bring me my arrows of desire. I can't remember the rest of it. Dark satanic mills. Belloc has a poem called Hanukkah Mill, and it's about a mill, but it's not about the dark satanic mills, which are the industrial mills of Lancashire and Yorkshire in the north, and Birmingham. It's about the windmills, where the miller that we hear about, not necessarily very endearingly in Chaucer, would have applied his trade. Sally is gone that was so kindly, Sally is gone from Hanukkah Hill. And the briar grows ever since then so blindly, and ever since then the clapper is still, and the sweeps have fallen from Hanukkah Mill. Hanukkah Hill is in desolation, ruin atop, and a field unploughed, and spirits that call on a fallen nation, spirits that loved her calling aloud, spirits abroad in a windy cloud, spirits that called and no one answers. Hanukkah's down and England's done, wind and thistle for pipe and dancers, and never a ploughman under the sun. never a ploughman, never a one. Things had changed irreparably, because even if, God willing, the dance reasserts itself and the race peters out, the scars will remain. But enough. I think we're getting somewhat wistful. We should let the wistfulness make way for whimsy. Merry England, like all good things, is eternal. You know, there's a nonsense said that if a tree were to fall down in a wood and no one was there to hear it, would it make a noise? Of course it would make a noise, because its falling down is not dependent upon us being there. If, and it's entirely possible the way things are going, in 200 years nobody can read, will that mean that Dante's Divine Comedy is any less glorious? In order to understand Dante's Divine Comedy, you have to understand St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologia. When nobody can read, and no one knows who St. Thomas Aquinas is, or indeed what a saint is, will it make Dante's Divine Comedy any less glorious? No, it won't, because it's glorious regardless of how ignorant people are. And of course we believe as well, of course, that we only live for 70 years and 10, and then we enter eternity where these things are glorified as they should be. The inn at the end of the world, as Chesterton says, where we'll meet Shakespeare and Dickens and all of his characters. And Tolkien says something similar in his poem Mythopoeia. So really, we're talking about those things that are. Those things that are, even if the world ceases to understand. The permanent things. The Chester Belloc, Chesterton and Belloc together, George Bernard Shaw said, were like a pantomime elephant. So synonymous they make two halves of the same pantomime beast. The Chester Belloc. Well, it's a war cry. And I'm going to finish my talk by some practical applications of Merry England and ale. In 1973, E.F. Schumacher wrote a book called Small is Beautiful that had a profound impact. It was really only saying the same thing Chesterton and Belloc had said. And Chesterton and Belloc had only said the same thing that Pope Leo XIII had said, that was reiterated by Pope Pius XI and was reiterated again by Pope John Paul II. That basically subsidiarity means that economics and politics and all life should be under God and should grow up from the family and not be imposed down by the state. Small business tend to be better than big business, small government tend to be better than big government. Well, ale came to the rescue. Very few things the English will get right other than ale. In 1971, how many people here were not alive in 1971? Just to make me feel old. Okay, before you were born. I was 10, it seems to me like yesterday, but in 1971 there were 4 Englishmen on holiday in Ireland. And they were sitting around in a bar in Ireland, a pub in Ireland, moaning into their pints of presumably Guinness about the state of English ale. Then basically 4 brewers controlled the whole of the market. These 4 men, as a Bellocian, I like the idea of 4 men, he wrote a book called The 4 Men, come back to England and begin something called the Campaign for Real Ale. Within 5 years, the campaign for Merrie ole has 30,000 members. The result of that is, instead of there being 4 mega breweries producing chemical fizz, for which even alcohol is probably a compliment as a description, you have now, I think the last stand I heard, 300 small brewers producing real ale or craft ale, all of which are unique, because some things are just better produced on a small scale. Ale is one of them, cheese is another, and it's, I think, a great source of hope that 4 men in a pub in Ireland can be inspired to come back to England and found an organisation that transforms the economy and the culture. There are now millions of people that would have forgotten what ale was, that now know exactly what it is in its multifarious forms. Better still, some of these small brewers become, I hate the word, consultants. And they go out and help other people start breweries, and they came over to here. And in the last 15, 20 years over here, there's been a similar revolution of microbreweries over here. Because the point is, of course, what I try to point out in my book Literary Converts, is that we're talking about a network of grace. All of us, in everything we do, change society at every moment. We change it for the worse, or we change it for the better, depending upon what it is that we do. These 4 men, as with the great saints of the church, are an inspiration. I'm going to, and this hurts, this is just to show that I can be magnanimous. I have to have a sip of ale to get me up to the job, but for an Englishman to voluntarily compliment the French. Sorry, it's stuck in it. But we've talked about Beowulf and Chaucer. We really at this stage need to mention the Song of Roland, because there's a wonderful line in the Song of Roland that is straight from, Belloc would appreciate. The pagans are wrong, Christians are right. No explanation, enough. And when they go on to death in the fight against the pagans, in fact the heathens, in fact, if you get the facts right, the Muslims, they cry, Mon joie, Mount Joy, heaven. And I'm going to now descend, as seems appropriate with talk on ale, from sublime to the utterly ridiculous. How many people here know Belloc's, I was going to say hymn, but that certainly isn't the right word, Belloc's poem, oblique song, The Sailor's Carol? Okay. I'm not going to sing it. I'm afraid I haven't enough ale, but try me later. Contains faith and hope, but precious little charity. Hey, it's for Christmas as well. Noel, 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 a Catholic tale have I to tell, and a Christian song have I to sing, while all the bells in Arundel ring. I pray good beef, and I pray good beer, this holy night of all the year. But I pray detestable drink for them that give no honour to Bethlehem. May all good fellows that here agree drink audit ale in heaven with me, and may all my enemies go to hell. Noel, 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 Noel. May all my enemies go to hell. Noel, Noel. I don't necessarily agree with that, but cheers.